Finally, before I start today's introduction, we'd like to thank retired Vice Admiral Dan Cooper for sponsoring today's luncheon. And with that, we are honored to have with us again, this is the third time he is with us, Ambassador Charles Ray, who's going to speak to us today on the subject of race, American diplomacy, and why diversity is so important. Charles Ray is a retired Foreign Service officer who served 30 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, and before that, 20 years in the U.S. Army. During his Army service, he served in military intelligence, special ops, and public affairs with tours of duty in Germany, Korea, Vietnam, and Panama, as well as posts throughout the United States. He retired from the Army in 1982 with the rank of Major. During 30 years in the Foreign Service, he was posted to China, Thailand, Sierra Leone, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Zimbabwe. His overseas assignments included service as Deputy Chief of Mission in Sierra Leone during that country's transition to democratic rule. He was the first U.S. Consul General in Ho Chi Minh City and was ambassador to Cambodia and Zimbabwe. From 2006 to 2009, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for POW Missing Personnel Affairs and Director of the Defense POW Missing Personnel Office. Since retiring from public service, Ambassador Ray has been a full-time freelance writer and consultant and is the author of more than 60 books of fiction and nonfiction, including 3 books on leadership. He is a frequent blogger and contributor to several internet news and content sites. He is also a photographer and artist and has worked as a journalist and artist for a number of publications in the U.S. and abroad, an interest that apparently dates to the late 1970s when he was the editorial cartoonist for the Spring Lake News, a weekly newspaper near Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He was the first chair of the American Foreign Service Association's Professionalism and Ethics Committee. He has also served as a consultant for the Department of Defense on personnel recovery and as an interagency subject matter expert during Army unit pre-deployment training. Ambassador Ray is a member of the American Foreign Service Association, the Association of Black American Ambassadors, and the American Academy of Diplomacy. Please join me in welcoming back to the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading, Ambassador Charles Ray.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, and I must have done something right if this is my third encounter with you. That's not what I normally do. You know, the issues of race, diversity, equity, and inclusion are in this country currently very sensitive issues, politically and socially, with a lot of people, politicians and none, opposing a lot of the diversity initiatives that the government has implemented over the last several years. And as someone who has been very much involved in bringing more diversity to the diplomatic service, to the military, and to the arms of government, I sometimes find it hard to restrain myself when I hear people saying that we shouldn't focus on diversity because what I see in that and what I hear in that is a complete lack of understanding not only of what diversity truly is, but what it brings to the table. The issues of race and diplomacy and diversity and diplomacy are very much intertwined and really go back in time to the very formation of the American Republic. Many people, very few people in fact, in this country have an understanding of America's diplomatic history or what diplomacy really is. Few people know, for example, that at the beginning of the Republic in 1775, Could the sound come down a little? I'm getting feedback. At the beginning, we absolutely refused to have anything to do with ambassadors. The feeling in the new American Republic was that the title ambassador was too closely associated with the royal courts of Europe and their intrigue, and we would have nothing to do with it. We did not, for example, appoint the first ambassador to another country until 1898. If you do the math, that's a long time to be a country and not have an ambassador. And the issue was we would appoint ministers. For some reason, it was felt that ministers we didn't associate that with the royal courts, and they were okay. The problem with that is that in diplomatic practice, your access to the host country and your access to many things depends on your rank order and protocol in the diplomatic system, and ambassadors from even the smallest, most inconsequential countries rank ahead of ministers no matter what country they come from. And it took us almost 100 years, well actually a little over 100 years, to realize that our opposition to traditional diplomacy was disadvantaging the U.S. in foreign countries, disadvantaging us in trade negotiations and in achieving the trade objectives that the country needed in order to grow economically. So eventually, 1898, we finally appointed an ambassador. Unlike most of the major countries at the time who had professional diplomatic services, we didn't. We did not have a career diplomatic service in this country until 1924. Prior to 1924, all of our diplomats were appointed by the president in office, and of course each time the president changed, all the appointments changed. This included everyone in an embassy down to and including the embassy clerks, and they primarily came from the wealthy East Coast, Upper East Coast families, people who were wealthy enough to be able to live abroad because the salaries have always been low, but they were unbelievably low during that period, and only the wealthy could afford to accept the diplomatic appointment. The issue there, though, is that this meant first that all of our diplomats were male. No women were admitted into the diplomatic service until after the 1920s. They were all Anglo-Saxon Protestant males from wealthy families, usually with hyphenated names, from certain enclaves in the upper Northeast, and a few from Virginia, where we also have some aristocratic families. Where we were disadvantaged prior to 1924 and prior to 1898 in that we did not have sufficient rank of our representatives to be in the front row, so to speak. From 1898 until 1924, we were disadvantaged in that you had more and more countries being formed, kingdoms breaking up and becoming countries with different attitudes, but our diplomatic corps was very much like a jar of mayonnaise. It was one consistent color and texture from top to bottom. And so our diplomats approached everything from an urban, upper-class, Ivy League perspective, which in the world of the 1800s until probably World War I maybe was acceptable, you could get by. But as the world became more complex, as more countries became independent and became part of the international system, having this monolithic approach to relations with them created its own set of problems. Here's where the race issue comes in. Just as an example, when Haiti became the first of the Caribbean, Latin American republics to gain its independence from France in the 1800s, the U.S. refused before 1875 to even grant recognition to Haiti because prior to the end of the Civil War and emancipation, the Southerners in Congress disagreed with recognizing a black-led republic that close to the U.S. because of the potential impact on their slave populations. Afterwards, 1875, with Grant in office, there was recognition of Haiti, but all of the ministers who were posted to Haiti were, again, from that Anglo-Saxon, northeast, wealthy background. You can imagine, at this point, from our perspective, many decades later, you can see how an upper-class patrician from Massachusetts might have a hard time communicating with a bunch of Franco-African revolutionaries in Haiti. It was, and I don't remember the date, but the first African-American chief of mission, minister, appointed was actually from Connecticut. A man by the name of Ebenezer Bassett became the first person of color to be made the chief of a diplomatic mission abroad. He was sent to Haiti. It was seen during his tenure the advantage of having someone with a different mindset and a different background. Bassett, because he had descended from slaves, he understood the sort of mentality of people who had escaped bondage, was able to communicate more effectively with the Haitian government than any of the previous ministers had been able to do. I'd like to say that the government's body politic learned that lesson and applied it. As usual, we fire and forget. That experience and that achievement really wasn't reflected in a change in the way we did diplomacy. Same thing goes for diversity in a broader sense, which is what I push. Women were well, first they were banned. After the 1920s, women were admitted in lower levels into the diplomatic service, but if a woman got married, she had to resign. We did not allow married women to be part of the American diplomatic service. Few or no Hispanics, Native Americans. I think we probably didn't recruit the first Native American until after the 1940s. Same thing with Asian Americans. People with different perspectives were completely left out of the recruitment process. Also, lacking was geographic diversity. As I said, there's an old saying about the American diplomatic service. It's partly true, is that the diplomatic service of the United States was pale, male, and Yale. But the issue there is that what was missing, in addition to ethnic minorities, in addition to women, we also lacked people from the Midwest, people from the South and the Southwest, people from rural areas. And so we had a diplomatic service right through until about 1980, in fact, that was overwhelmingly urban. From the 1940s on, we also, in addition to the East Coast, had the sort of West Coast enclave centered around Stanford University. But you had these urban, educated elites who made up the bulk of the service. This really became problematic in the 1950s and after World War II with countries in Asia that had been colonies gaining their independence, with the independence of many countries in Africa, and sending people from the U.S. to represent the U.S. to these countries got to be an issue when we realized that while we sent these people to represent us, they didn't really, in the eyes of the people they were working with, represent us. And I'll explain what I mean by that. You know, we Americans are history blind. We have, the history gene is underdeveloped in us. We have a hard time seeing the world through other people's eyes. We don't understand our own history very well, and we seldom understand the history and culture of other countries. That's not the same in other countries. When we go to a country, just a little war story. When I went to Zimbabwe in 2009 as ambassador, one of my first field trips, if you will, I visited a program where we were supporting, providing treatment for people living with AIDS, and one of the programs that we were pushing was circumcision, because it's been shown that male circumcision can reduce AIDS infections by 15 to 20%. That's very difficult to do in many African societies because of the sort of male mentality. There was a young man in this one village, he was 18 years old, who stepped up and said he would be the first male in his village to get circumcised, and literally shamed the rest of the men in the village into, they couldn't let an 18-year-old beat them. So he was the poster child for the AIDS prevention programs in Zimbabwe, and we were introduced. This kid was about this tall. He was just really tall. And I'm talking to him, and I made a comment that, you know, he could be a basketball player. And he sort of smiled and he looked, and this is not in a huge metropolitan area. This was in a little village in Zimbabwe, where they used generators for electricity, and no one had a telephone. And I said, you know, you could be a great basketball player. And he looked at me straight faced and he said, I love playing basketball, but I'm no LeBron James. Now, to add to that, I didn't know who he was talking about at first. And one of my young staffers later explained it to me. But what that says is that we don't realize, depending on our own background, that many people outside this country know more about this country than we do. Okay? And when you further constrain your diplomatic service by taking it from just one very small insular group, you isolate yourself even more. And this is why diversity is so important. When we represent ourselves to other countries, we truly need to represent ourselves, because other people in other countries know the makeup of the U.S., know the history of the U.S., and when they walk into one of our embassies and all they see are white males, it sends a signal to them that we really don't want to be sending, and sometimes aren't aware that we're sending. And when we go to them, as we often do, and criticize them for failure to include minority segments of their population, how do you think that message goes over? Like a lead balloon. Because our very action, as inadvertent and unthinking as it is, undercuts our message. Same thing with women. We talk about women's rights around the world. As diplomats, we often are sent into, the diplomatic term is démarche, which is a way of saying criticize, other governments about their poor treatment of women, especially in a lot of the underdeveloped world that are male-dominated societies. And when we go into a government and we say to them, you are not treating your women fairly, you know the first thing most foreign ministers say? You don't pay your women the same thing you pay your men, so who are you to talk? This is a hard argument to overcome. It is a real difficult argument to overcome. If, on the other hand, the person who goes in to deliver that démarche is a female ambassador, the foreign ministers are usually quiet. They can't use, you can't, it's like when I, as an ambassador, walked into, when I was ambassador to Cambodia, and I had to talk to the prime minister about the poor way they treated their ethnic minorities. he couldn't argue back the way he could have if, say, you had been the ambassador. And this is a plus of diversity. If we show our country the way it is, that in fact we are living by those standards that we insist that other countries live by, and we show that by how we staff, how we promote, and how we deploy our own people, then our messages are strengthened. It also opens doors. Diversity can open doors that are otherwise closed. I served in China from 1983 to about 1987, in southern China and in northeast China. The U.S. presence, U.S. diplomatic presence in China at that time was really relatively new, and the Chinese are paranoid, to put it politely, about foreigners in their midst. They like to have control of what foreigners do. At the same time, the Chinese paint themselves as the friends of the third world, is the way several of my Chinese counterparts used to put it. And so in China at any time, you have large numbers of students from the Caribbean, from the Pacific Islands, from Africa, who are there at Chinese expense as students. In the 1980s, when we went to China, they had not seen many. I think at the time I served in China from 83 to 87, we had an embassy and we had 4 consulates, 3 consulates. We had a total of 4 African Americans in the entire country out of a total American staff of over 1,000. So it's safe to say that most of the Chinese had not seen a non-white diplomat, American. So when we were sent to Shenyang in northeast China to open relations there, the Chinese put into effect their American diplomats must have an escort with them wherever they go, and certain places are off limits. But because I have a wife who's Asian, clearly, and because I don't look like to the average Chinese, an American, quite often we wound up being able to go places that diplomats weren't allowed to go, and usually would be there for a while before someone recognized that they'd slipped up and let us in. It also meant that when I went out to do the things that diplomats do, and that is gather information, learn the local situation, that I could move a lot more freely, even around the town, than one of my colleagues in the consulate would be able to do, because as I'm walking down the street in blue jeans and a pullover, I look to the average Chinese just like another one of those Jamaican or African students that they have running around all over the place, and you might get a glance, but they'd look away. I once had to interview a dissident who had some really interesting information he wanted to share with us, but he didn't want to be seen coming into the consulate. Couldn't be, because we had Chinese guards on the gate, and he certainly didn't want an American diplomat showing up at his house. So we did the interview with him in a rather unique way. I had a bicycle and I rode around a lot, and so we agreed to meet at a certain intersection and rode with our bikes about 6 feet apart, in and out of traffic and up one street and down the other for about 2 hours while I interviewed the guy. You know, and imagine trying to dodge buses and taxis and other cyclists while you're trying to remember the answers the guy's giving you to the questions, because you can't make notes when you're riding a bike. But I was able to pull that off because I was just another third world person riding my bike around Shenyang, not a foreign diplomat. I know the local police never figured out who I was, or never cared, because otherwise I would have been stopped. And only maybe 1 or 2 people in the government office that were responsible for monitoring us knew my habits, and they sort of, it's no big deal. But that enabled us to get information that otherwise would have been closed off from. And I could give you dozens of examples of where having a minority or having a woman or having a person with a disability in a diplomatic scenario allows you to do more than you might otherwise be able to do, allows you to establish a kind of rapport that would otherwise be, if not impossible, extremely difficult, and lends a credibility to your endeavors that you otherwise wouldn't have. Another advantage of diversity is that it brings to the table fresh and new points of view for identifying and solving problems. As someone who's studied and worked on leadership for decades, I'm a firm believer that if you have an organization where everyone comes from the same background and thinks the same way, you have an organization that's on the verge of failure. Because the first crisis that hits, you won't be prepared for it, because if everyone thinks the same way, you get into a groupthink mindset, it becomes do today what you did yesterday, and don't make change because change is threatening. You have to have the people who throw the oddball ideas into the pot, who come up with the, how about we try this? We've never done this before, in order to be able to respond to changing circumstances. And in diplomacy, the one constant is the constant change that you have to deal with. No day. I've been asked on many occasions, describe an average day in the life of a diplomat. And my description is, there ain't no such thing. Every day is different. In fact, from 8 to 12 and from 1 to 4 are not the same. I once, when we arrived in Cambodia, for example, it was right after Christmas. We arrived the day after Christmas. The place was quiet and peaceful, almost boring. Meeting people, it was fun, no stress. Everyone seemed happy. The country had sort of calmed down from a violent period they'd gone through. They were preparing for elections, and I was under the assumption that my first few months on the job was actually going to be really boring. And then about 49 or 50 days after I arrived, about 44 days after my arrival, I had a visitor from Washington that I was taking around to government offices for meetings, and we were on the way back to the embassy from a meeting, and we saw a crowd off on a side street, and being curious, we turned to see. There were people with signs and chanting and obviously not happy, and they were marching down the street. It's the first demonstration I had seen since my arrival in the country. And just curious, so I get back to the embassy, and I had my political officer and my defense attaché to hit the streets to see if they could find out what was going on. Well, what we discovered was that a group of students, a group of about 1,000 students in fact, had converged on the Thai embassy in Phnom Penh and were protesting because of some episode in some Thai soap opera that got picked up on Cambodian TV that they felt was insulting to the Cambodian people and culture. And I thought, wow, that's okay, I guess students do that. We didn't really think much of it, so I just gave instructions. Keep an eye on it. That evening, me, along with a few members of my senior staff, were invited to a reception hosted by the defense minister. And we're in this big ballroom and doing the normal diplomatic chit-chat and sipping cocktails and eating finger food. And I noticed suddenly the senior officials from the police, national police, and the defense ministry were running off into the corner and frantically talking on their phones. And that's a sure sign that something's amiss. So I pulled the defense minister aside and just said, okay, don't BS me. What's going on? And he said, you should go back to your house and stay there. The student demonstrations have gotten a little out of hand, and they are asking for the military to come in and restore order. That's a quiet, peaceful, fun day suddenly turns very ugly very quick. That night, From my second floor window in my residence, which overlooked the main street going to the Thai embassy, I watched demonstrators go down the street. Then I watched the army go down the street. Then I watched demonstrators running back up the street, dodging the army who were cracking heads and cracking down. Every Thai business in the capital and the Thai embassy were burned to the ground. Thai ambassador had to climb over a wall behind his embassy to escape probably death if the mob had caught him. The border was closed, and for about 36 hours, there was a fear that Cambodia and Thailand would go to war. That's a life of a diplomat, and that's how a day can change on a dime. And if you have a diplomatic establishment where everyone sort of thinks the same way, as opposed to one where you've got a lot of different points of view that can be brought to bear and analyzed, you are caught off guard by that, and you don't have the capacity to respond appropriately. In my case, I had one of the most diverse embassies in Southeast Asia at the time, starting with me. I had my deputy was a part Japanese, part Filipino. I had Asians. I had a couple of people. I had one of my staff members had been a museum curator. I mean, I had the weirdest staff in the business. But when we sat down to look at the situation and decide how to deal with it, some really creative and ultimately useful ideas were laid out, and we came through. No one on the staff, none of the Americans in Cambodia were injured or in any way threatened, and we were given plaudits by people back in Washington for how we handled the situation. And I'm convinced that had we been a more homogeneous and less diverse embassy, there would have been problems, there would have been mistakes, and we managed to get through it without mistakes because we had instead of having one point of view on the table and, okay, we'll have to try it if it works. No, there were several points of view on the table that you could analyze and modify at will and come up with a way to deal with the situation more effectively. And that's what diversity is all about. We need to have a diplomatic service with people from rural areas. If you grew up in Manhattan and you're a diplomat in an agrarian country where 80% of the people live in a rural area and make their lives walking behind the buffalo, how do you communicate with them? How do you understand what motivates them or what they mean? And you can't. You try as you might, you can be the most brilliant person on the planet, but if you have no experience in it, you're learning on the fly, and in a crisis, learning on the fly is not going to fly. It doesn't work very well. We have supported UN positions on things like the rights of women and the rights of children. You need people who have an innate understanding of these things, who can discuss it credibly and not just recite talking points. I mean, when I am talking to a foreign minister or head of state, and I talk about how devastating it is for certain members of their society to be treated as second-class citizens and to be marginalized, I know what I'm talking about. I've been there. You know, I grew up in a town that had segregated parking, and in the 40s and in the 50s and 60s, in a school system where I read and used hand-me-down books and sat behind much-used desks. First new textbook I ever had in my hands was in college. So when I say I know how demoralizing and how devastating it can be to be sort of discarded and disregarded, I know what I'm not just repeating a talking point. I am talking from experience. When I talk to someone about how providing education and providing sort of support helps to bring people, or helps for people to bring themselves out of poverty, I know what I'm talking about. I grew up on a pig farm, a poor pig farm at that. And needless to say, I'd never go back, but I know what it feels like to be poor. And so when I talk about the impact of poverty on someone, or the impact of a second-class education, or no education at all, I talk from a position that the people who are listening are forced to listen to. And they can't say, oh, you know, you're just reciting what you've been told. That is what diversity brings to our diplomacy. It's needed more now than ever. You have a world that is very diverse. You know, I run a program for the Foreign Policy Research Institute over here in Philadelphia. I run the Africa Research Program. And one of the issues that we've hammered home day after day is that Africa matters because, and if you look at the African continent, 54 countries, it is the youngest continent on the planet, with more than 60% of the people under 15. By 2050, it will account for 25% of the world's total population. It is also urbanizing at an unbelievable rate. In 1976, when I went to Africa the first time, 80% of the population was rural. It's now, I think, 60%, and by 2050 it will be 40%. 60% will be urban. They will have some of the largest cities on the planet. And the continent will have 2.7 billion people. Over half of them will be under 25. We need people to deal with that reality who understand it, who understand where those people are coming from, what motivates them, and to be able to develop effective ways to communicate with them, to help them create better lives for themselves, and consequently not create for the rest of the world. That's what diversity does, and that's my message that I have bored many in Washington with ad infinitum since my retirement. I think there were people who were happy when I retired, and they weren't so happy when they realized that now I have no brakes on what I can say. And they sort of regret that I'm now a freelancer with an audience. But the issue at hand is, how do we as a country develop the ability to deal effectively with the rest of the world in a way that ensures our security and economic prosperity while helping the rest of the world achieve a sort of peaceful, prosperous future for itself. And I am convinced that among the many things that we can do, having a diplomatic service that looks like us, that has people from places like Reading, Pennsylvania, like East Texas, who are able to go into foreign capitals and talk to people with authority, will give us the necessary clout to be able to see that future in 2050 for the youngsters who are sitting here will be a brighter and more prosperous future. And with that, I'm going to stop yakking and answer any questions you have.
Excellent presentation. Thank you, Ambassador Ray. David, did you want to do any announcements at the end?
You know, I don't know why I ever bother writing this stuff down. I never read it.
So we have time for a few questions. If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. I will come to you with the microphone. Please remember it is my microphone. You will be tempted to reach out and grab it. Do not do that. I'm going to start with our students, so I'll come back here in the corner, and then I'll loop around to that side, and then we'll work the middle of the room a little bit more.
Hello. I wanted to ask about what you said about the need for diversity within diplomatic communities. How often are there hive minds like what you brought up about people thinking the same point of view?
Groupthink is endemic to almost every bureaucracy. Most of our embassies, well, first of all, most of our embassies are understaffed, and so that creates a problem in and of itself. The issue with the groupthink and with the hive mind, as you put it, is usually back here in Washington, where the people who make the decisions and provide the resources reside. And how often? Too often. I couldn't give you a number, but the fact is that if you go into almost any office where decisions are made, you will find, for example, in our civil service, and civil servants are people who get hired, and many of them. I worked for a man back in 1991 who'd been in the same job for 20 years. Okay, and when you have a situation like that, and you don't have diversity in that organization, then you get hive minds. I'll give you a real-life example. When I was the deputy chief of our mission in Sierra Leone in the 1990s, in certain countries, in addition to our regular salary, we get paid what's called hardship pay. And that's because we're in a country where there are hardships. I mean, health conditions are bad, weather's bad, whatever. Sierra Leone, at the time that I was there, was experiencing a rebel war. I mean, about half the country was under rebel control. The power grid was so poor that in our embassy we had to run generators 24/7. Our water supply came from large tanks on the tops of our building that had to be refilled once a month. And you had things like snakes and scorpions and whatever. I mean, you could wake up and fortunately we lived on the 3rd or 4th floor in our building, and so most of the really bad things didn't get that high. Back in Washington, the office that makes the determination of how much hardship pay posts get was staffed by I think about 12 civil servants, none of whom had ever served overseas. None, not one. And one day, I get a message from Washington that said, your differential is being cut from 25% to 10%. When I came to and came down off the ceiling, I got back to them and went, why? Why would you? Well, we have to save money. Well, don't save it on our backs. I mean, we went back and forth. Finally, the way I managed to get it overruled, and this, you really don't like things like this to happen. As fortunately no one was hurt in the incident. During this argument, our ambassador, who lived in a really beautiful house on a hill overlooking the city, came down to her kitchen one day and found a black mamba in her kitchen that had crawled under a crack in the door. You know what a black mamba is? Yeah, one of the most poisonous snakes in the world. And before the gardener came in with a machete and chopped it to pieces, she had the presence of mind to take a picture of it. And we sent that picture back to Washington and said, you think this is a 10% post? Come out here and spend a few days with us. Okay. And that's sort of a rambling way to say the hive mind is unfortunately all too prevalent. You have people who sit in the comfort of air-conditioned apartments in Washington, D.C., and think that they can make decisions for people who are living in grass huts. And it doesn't work that way. But until you get people in a situation where, had that office had someone who'd ever served in West Africa, they would have had someone who could say to the director, you can't do that. Sierra Leone, my God, are you kidding? You can't cut their differential. That's one of the hardest hardship posts on the planet. This was, before all the wars. Well, we had our own war. I mean, you could hear the gunfire and the grenades going off even in the city. So the hive mind it's with us. And I guess as long as we have bureaucracies, we will have it. My goal is to knock as many holes in that hive as possible and insert a few strange bees to get a change.
Thank you, Ambassador. We're all the way over here on your right-hand side. Got a question from one of our students here? Way right.
Two questions, actually. The first one is with your experience, what would you tell young people in here, a lot of young people younger than me and my students and so on, what would it take to go about becoming ambassador? What would they have to major in? Because obviously it's pretty envious of position to be in where you're in. That's the first part. And the second part is which of the... I'll just say.
Okay. Wow, okay. Let's see, what should I answer? Well, I'll answer that second one first, because every country that I have been in has had attractions and things that I've liked, and have also had things that have scared the bejesus out of me. Sierra Leone, good example. They had a war going on, and I once almost got a very senior State Department official killed because I had a tendency to like to explore and go places he probably shouldn't go. And this guy who was the special envoy for peace in Liberia had come out to get sort of briefings on the ground, and as the number 2 in the embassy, I was his control officer and escort. And when it was time for him to leave, rather than taking him down to the wharf and putting him on the ferry to go across to the airport, which was on a peninsula, I thought it would be really nice to show him a little of the countryside. So we drove up the coast and down the peninsula. And it was an uneventful trip, I thought. After I dropped him off, and I took the ferry back myself because it was getting late and I didn't want to do it in the dark. And I got back to Freetown and had to go to a reception, and I met the foreign minister at the reception, and he was asking me where I'd been, and I told him, and when I mentioned that I had driven that morning up the coast and down the peninsula, and he goes, "Did you go through it?" He named a little town right at the turn in the road. I said, "Yeah." "What time?" "I don't know, about 11:15, I guess." He said, "You know, at 1 o'clock it was attacked and burned to the ground by the rebels." When word of that got back to Washington, they weren't very happy that I had exposed, I mean, because whoever attacked it had to be on the hills looking when we drove through, and whether they decided to let us drive through before, I don't know, but that was a not so nice thing there. But nice, I mean, we had a chance to get out to the countryside. I remember we were in canoes following a herd pod, whatever, of hippopotamuses who were in the river. And that was fun. It was great time. So you know, I've had good times and bad. The only place I've been where I would say I had a bad time from start to finish, I did when I worked at the Pentagon, I had to go to Moscow once. I didn't enjoy that at all. Now, on your first question, the question should not be how do you become an ambassador, but how do you become a diplomat? Because unless you're wealthy and a political campaign donor, you don't just become an ambassador, not a career type. How do you become a diplomat? One, you have an interest in it, an interest in other cultures, and you know, meeting people and having new adventures. You take a written exam, an assessment, and an oral exam, a physical, so that you're shown to be physically fit to serve anywhere, and a security check for suitability to get a security clearance, and then you become an entry-level diplomat, and you work your way depending on your career field, and we have 5. You choose your career field: political, economic, public diplomacy, management, or consular. And that's a long explanation. There's a website, www.careers.state.gov. You can go to that website, and it shows you the different career fields, and it also talks about the application process. Once you're accepted and in, and you go through training, there's a 5-year probationary period where you do different jobs to demonstrate your competence. And try for tenure. Once you're tenured, then you're part of the career diplomatic corps. And much like the military, you're rated on your performance throughout your career, and annually promotion boards meet, and they look at people's records, and they select the most outstanding, and they get promotions. Unlike the civil service, where you're hired at a grade and you stay at that grade until you change jobs. As a civil servant, as a foreign service diplomat, you are hired at a grade, and then you progress to higher grades through your performance. Becoming an ambassador, technically, okay, when you reach a certain level of seniority, you can compete for a chance to be nominated as an ambassador. Whether your career or whether you are, you know, an outsider who gets an appointment by the president, you still are required to go through the nomination process. For career types, it means a committee in the State Department has to review and approve you. The Secretary of State then has to approve it, and then it's submitted to the White House for the president's approval, where it will then be sent to Congress, to the Senate for confirmation. How do you get there? You know, there's many different ways to get there as there are people. I know people who have come in at the entry level and their objective is to be an ambassador one day. I don't know many who've ever achieved it, because if you're that type of careerist, my experience has been you're going to do things in ways that are going to earn you a reputation that no one's going to want to appoint you dog catcher. The people who have, the career people who have become ambassadors have usually done it through being outstanding in what they do at whatever level they are, who constantly seek new challenges and you know, seek to better themselves, and who are seen as a net positive to the organization. Now, in my case, it was dumb luck and a joke. I mean, I was selected to be the first U.S. Consul General in Ho Chi Minh City on the strength of the fact that the Assistant Secretary of Consular Affairs at the time, the late Mary Ryan, was a personal friend of mine. We knew each other professionally, and she'd been impressed with the work that I had done in China. And so when the country director for Vietnam was a friend of mine who had been my boss when I worked in Northeast China, and he suggested I apply for the job, and she was on the committee that made the final decision, and Mary Ryan was one of these, she gets her way, and she decided she wanted me. So I got that job. While I was in Vietnam, it was interesting because being a military veteran and going back to where I had served twice in the military was an interesting experience, because a lot of the people I had to work with in 1998 when I went as a diplomat were people I had tried to kill when I was there in the 60s. And as one said, we're really lucky you weren't such a good shot. No, but at the time, and next door in Cambodia, the ambassador there was having all kinds of trouble. I mean, and it was self-inflicted trouble. And just before I left, my deputy and I were sitting around just having coffee, chewing the fat, and talking about the latest dumb thing this guy had done. And my deputy said, you know, he's going to get fired one of these days. You should tell him to give you his job. You know, that'd make a good joke. So I sent this email to the personnel office to a guy that I knew there, and I said, hey, if you fire so-and-so, I'd like the job. This is a joke. I thought it was a joke. So I forgot it. I sent it and fire and forget. My tour ends. We come back to the U.S. Our household goods and personal effects arrive. We were at home one day unpacking, and the phone had been installed. The phone rings. I pick up the phone. It's the guy from the personnel office and said, oh, congratulations. The Secretary and the White House have approved your nomination to be the next ambassador to Cambodia. What? So I don't know. I mean, that's literally, that's how it happened. I did not really seriously campaign for it because, I mean, this guy had a long time to go, and I didn't think I had a shot. Zimbabwe was much the same. I was working in the Pentagon as an Deputy Assistant Secretary and getting ready to retire. And I got a call from the Africa Bureau at the State Department. Another old friend of mine said, our ambassador in Zimbabwe has health problems and he's going to have to come out. Would you agree to the nomination to go there? Oh, yeah, okay. Why not? She didn't like it too much when I went home and told her, but so why not? I actually didn't think I would make the cut, and this was during the Bush administration. because I was working for the Bush administration in the Pentagon. So I get approved, the White House approves it, the packets are all done, all the paperwork's done, everything's ready to go, the election's held, he loses. So I'm thinking, okay, well, that's the end of that, I'll go ahead and retire. After the election, sometime in December, the transition team for the Obama administration called me at the Pentagon and said, we're keeping you on the list, don't make any plans. Okay, I have no idea why. I mean, it's just, so how do you become an ambassador? I honestly don't know, just luck.
And here we are all the way at the back of the room. I think this is going to be our last question because of the time.
I answer too long, don't I? That's sorry.
Hi. I'm looking around the room and I see these young people, okay? I'm a woman and I'm white. And what's interesting, I think about the children that are here. Sorry, I'm calling these children. But we have a lot of diversity in Berks County, but we also have a lot of racial issues in Berks County. If you live in the city, it's not, you can be more tolerant. It's important for everyone to respect one another. I think about that because we had a neighbor who became the principal at Reading High School, and I tell you about this because he has a Spanish background. He's from El Salvador. And he had a student come into his office for discipline. And this young boy came in and he looked at him and he said, oh, he said, you're like me, because he was Hispanic and so was the principal. And he said, I expected a big white man to discipline me. And I think that made such a big difference in his life, and he followed through and wasn't a discipline problem after that. And I think about that because these young people might be doing something like you are, but they have to understand about racial issues. You have to accept everybody and learn from that. And you provided a lot of background, but you have a background that you went through a lot of things to be accepted as well.
Thank you. No, you're absolutely right. But my advice to young people, you're right. Everyone's deserving of respect. But I think one of the keys to getting that respect across communities is you have to have respect for yourself. I remember an interview that Reggie Jackson, the baseball player, once was being interviewed, and the interviewer asked him something about, who did he thought the most of him, and his response was, I really don't care. What matters is what I think of myself. If you respect yourself and your ability, it then becomes easier for you to accord that respect to others. And if you respect for yourself, you will get more respect from others. Now, is everyone going to respect you? No. Is everyone going to accept you? No. But as long as you respect yourself, you won't let that lack of acceptance on the part of a few ignorant people deter you from doing what you're capable of doing and what you set your mind on doing. And the other is learn to listen and look. I think I was asked a question, I don't know if it was here or this morning, about reading the room. Learn to read the room. Learn how the unspoken things that you say with your body, with your facial expressions, and with your hands communicate to other people, and how you respond to the non-verbal things that other people do. And when you have this level of self-awareness, it's much easier. And again, I go back, say it again and again. Have complete respect for yourself and your abilities. And that, together with getting the best education that you can for the rest of your life, will do you in good stead and will make you successful in whatever you decide to do. I mean, whether it's in foreign relations or whether it's running for local office, Those are traits that everyone needs. And you know, you make a point that I think is really good, and that's, you know, I talk about, you know, the diversity. A lot of people, young people from rural areas, don't look at foreign affairs, international relations jobs as being for them, because, as one young lady I worked with once said, there was no one in my town who had ever been more than 100 miles away from my town until I left. Someone has to be first, you know, and so if you don't see you in an organization that's doing something that you'd like to do, then you be that example. Work to get yourself there, and then once you are there, reach back. Let others see you being the best that you can be, and you will inspire them. And if you only inspire one, if each person inspires one other person, just think of, over time, the progress that can be made. But most of all, if I have to leave you with one thing, I repeat it until you get tired and go to sleep. Be yourself. Be the self that you want to be. Don't let other people define you. You define who you are and live up to it. Because at the end of the day, it matters less what other people think about you than it does what you think about you when you're looking at yourself in the mirror. Okay? And with that, I want to thank you all. I really enjoyed it.